Thank you so much, Chris. And Doug, you guys have really set a good context for where we are and how SLOs, I mean, there are so many things in here you're going to hear again from me. But in Austin, we've been working on SLOs for about 10 years. We began really small, and Chris talked about if you have the opportunity to pilot, you should, and I agree with her 100%. So we started really small at 9 campuses, and we've slowly increased that over time, and this is the first year that all of our teachers are participating in writing SLOs. Currently, SLOs live in our appraisal system, which is part of our human capital system that we call Professional Pathways for Teachers, or PPFT. So when I refer to that, I just kind of wanted you to know what the PPFT stands for. So you've seen several different definitions of what is an SLO, so I wanted to share what our definition in Austin is of an SLO, because we know everybody looks at it a little differently. Our SLOs focus on individual student growth, and teachers set targeted goals at the beginning of a course and strive to achieve them by the end of the year. And sometimes the course is actually a semester-long course, so if that's the case, then they'll strive to achieve their goals by the end of the semester. The SLO has to focus on an area of need for their students, and we hope that it's a collaborative process that they share with their colleagues, they share with their administrators, and ideally with their students as well, so that they're all working towards a common goal. It does count as 15% of the student growth component in our appraisal system, and most teachers write one SLO that focuses on the largest group of students that they teach the largest course. The SLO appraisal score is based on the student's growth at the end of the year, so the teacher score is based on the number of students who meet the growth target. So it's not a yes or no, you made your goal, so you get points. You didn't make your goal, you get 0 points. It's a sliding scale based on how many students meet that goal. So why use SLOs? And I think you've heard this from both Doug and Chris, that there are lots of reasons to use them. One being that they are very flexible and adaptable. You can set up your business rules so that they meet your context and they meet the needs that you want to use them for. They can be used for all teachers. It's something that you can adapt and fix so that it works in different contexts. And it is aligned to the content and needs of students and what's going on as far as like your district needs, your initiatives, and things like that. I think the most powerful piece of SLOs is that it promotes those best practices like reflection, data use, goal setting. All of those are things we want to encourage our teachers to do, and this is another way of getting them to think about those things in a more kind of controlled setting, in a more explicit way. Often teachers do these things. They participate in these practices, but it's not explicit to everyone, and that's one of the things that SLOs will do for you. It also offers another measure not related to the state assessment, and that was one of the things that we were looking at when we started this process, but it was also really looking at how do we promote those best practices. And I think ideally you want teachers to have that ownership of SLOs, that it's their goals, they're working on them, it's something that's really important to what they're doing in their context. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what our SLO process looks like in Austin. This infographic kind of takes you through the teacher view of what happens during the year. So it starts with a needs assessment. Teachers collect their data, identify the student needs. They also look at student strengths because that's really important for thinking about how you're going to move your students during the year. And we have them reflect on their goals. We also have them think about how does this align to the standards and what you're teaching during the year. We also encourage them to go in and review all of the assessments that are in our SLO database that align to the needs that they've identified. And if they don't find an assessment in the SLO database that they can select, then they can create their own with the appropriate standards aligned to it and following a process that's outlined in our support guide. They write a learning objective based on those standards. My students will be able to do X, Y, or Z by the end of the year. And they select a growth target based on assessment, and they enter all of this information into our SLO database. We do have a specific way of doing our growth target, and I'm going to talk about that on a different slide, but it is selecting a growth target. It's not creating your own. They administer that pre-assessment to their class. They enter those results in the SLO database, and we have the appraisers validate their SLOs. And we've chosen the word validate for a very specific reason, that it isn't about approving what the teachers have done as much as it is making sure that they've followed the guidelines, because we want the teachers to own this process. Now, the most important part of what they do during the year is to teach, and so we want them to monitor their progress by planning and spiraling this information into their curriculum throughout the year to make sure that we're closing those achievement gaps, because that's one of the main purposes of doing SLOs, is to really get them to think about those needs and to close those gaps. At the end of the year, teachers will post-assess their kids. They'll enter those results into the SLO database, and it will calculate the total for their appraisal score. And then, of course, we want them to have that conversation with their appraiser at the end of the year. What went well? What could they do differently? What might they think about that would work differently? So that's sort of what our SLO process looks like throughout the year. So how have SLOs evolved in Austin ISD? We originally started this as part of our strategic compensation initiative, and it started at those 9 schools and thinking about how we wanted to develop that process and think about encouraging those behaviors in teachers. Now it's part of the appraisal system, and it's not directly tied to compensation, but that's where it started, was in our compensation initiative. In the very first year of working with SLOs, teachers wrote 2 SLOs, one for all of the students in a course and their largest group of students, and one that could be targeted. You could pick a specific group of kids that you wanted to work with, or you could do another all students. We also only had a single growth target, so we had things like 75% of my students will improve by 40 points, and we learned really quickly that that was not a good way to go, that it needed to be more flexible than that, especially given the wide range of performance that we saw on the pre-assessments. We also learned a lot of other lessons about assessment quality and the needs that teachers had, and how to look at growth targets. That first year was a big learning year for us. So in the second year, we rolled out some tiered targets to allow for different amounts of growth based on those pretest scores. And that was successful to some extent in helping differentiate based on the student scores, but it was still lacking in that really individualizing to the student level, because some students were still, and those ranges weren't quite big enough, and we didn't want to have growth targets that were incredibly long. So we were really struggling with what that growth target would look like. So we continued to think about, how do we help improve assessment quality? How do we work on these different things? In our third and fourth year, we started moving toward team SLOs, where teams of teachers would work together and be accountable for all of the students together as a team. And there was a great deal of anxiety around that when we started it, but it actually proved to be really successful in promoting collaboration and shared practices. And we've continued to work on that growth target issue throughout that time, and we finally came up with what we call a growth formula, or half the distance to a perfect score. And so one of my team actually kind of looked at all the data over time of how students were performing and came up with a formula that actually allowed teachers to individualize the growth target based on the student's pretest score. And so it's the pretest subtracted from the maximum score available on the test and divided by 2. That's half the distance to a perfect score. And so we really spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to get to that right growth target, and it actually has worked really, really well for teachers. It takes a lot of the guessing part out of SLOs and has made it a lot more about looking at your needs and looking at that assessment piece and not worrying so much about the growth target. We've continued to refine and revise, and as much as we like team SLOs, it doesn't really lend itself well to the appraisal piece because it's about your practice as an individual. And we do have a school-wide component, but we wanted that to be relatively small. And so we've moved back to using one SLO for appraisal that focuses on the largest course or the largest group of students that a teacher teaches. So that's sort of where we've been and where we are now. We have developed a fairly intense system of supports to help teachers and administrators through the SLO process. We have a team of 4 at the district office who go to campuses and support teachers in the development of their SLOs. They work with teachers individually or in small teams throughout the months of September and October. In fact, they just came back from what they call their campus tours. So they've been on campuses every day since the very end of August until this week. And they're available to help teachers while they're on campus or through email or phone calls whenever that's needed. They also work with administrators through the validation process. So even though we've seen them back in the office for a couple of days, they're going to head back out on campuses to help administrators as they look at SLOs as they're submitted. We have also developed SLO campus contacts who attend training in the summer to help support the SLO process. they're able to help teachers find resources, help with navigating the SLO database, and provide basic information on the SLO process. They also have access to the SLO team's cell phone numbers, so they can contact them anytime with questions that we ask them. Don't share that information, just for those of you who are in this role. For the whole appraisal system, we've developed a support guide to help teachers with the various aspects of the system, but a significant portion of our support guide is dedicated to the SLO process. And that support guide takes you through every step that I kind of outlined in that infographic. It goes into in-depth how you go through that process and what that looks like. In addition to that, the team has developed an internal SLO website that has videos, step sets to help teachers through the process of developing an SLO, but also through the process of entering that information into the database. And we've been developing an assessment database to help teachers with the idea of assessment and what good assessments look like. And so we've been working with teachers over the last, 4 or 5 summers on developing those assessments. They do an assessment writing workshop each summer, and we add to the database. And this last year, we actually hit the 500 mark for how many assessments we have in the SLO database, and we're still adding to it as we go. So every year, we continue to build and refine and revise our assessments and our assessment database. Those assessments are available for teachers to use, but they're not mandated for teachers to use. For administrators, we spend a significant portion of our appraiser training on SLOs and how to identify the needed elements, what it is that you need to look for, how do you help support your teachers through the process, what supports are available to them. So we spend a lot of time looking at those things. We've had quite a few successes over the last 10 years. Developing the campus-based training for teachers, it really is an individualized process for teachers so they can get the support that they need. Some teachers are really great at looking at data. Some teachers are really good at figuring out how to look at their standards. So it really isn't, there isn't a set training that we do when we go to a campus. It really is based on the needs of those teachers, and that has been a huge success. It's one of the things that garners the most praise with our SLOs is the SLO team and the work that they do on campuses. We're also really proud of the fact that we have a 2-day appraiser training, and half of one of those days is dedicated to SLOs, so that administrators really have a feeling for what those SLOs look like and how they should be looking at it as they go through the year. We promote this as teacher professional growth. This isn't a gotcha measure. It really is intended to help you grow and be successful and to know where it is that your students are at the beginning of the year and what impact you've had over the course of the year in that area. It is an alternative measure to the state assessment, so as we are required to use student growth in our appraisal system, it is one of the things that allows us to do that without having to look at the state measures. We love the fact that it encourages reflective practice and improves the use of data. Over time, that's one of the things that's come out through the surveys that we've done and focus groups is that teachers actually do use their SLOs to help improve their practice. We've also had lots and lots of challenges throughout the years, and obviously one of the big challenges is the assessment tools. When we started this process, we had very limited assessment tools available for teachers. We had district assessments, but nothing that really focused in on a specific area of need. And so we've had to build those assessment tools over time, and it's been a really worthwhile process, but it's very challenging to go through that and to get a bank of assessments that teachers can use. I think another thing that I don't know that we were fully aware of was that the assessment literacy piece, and I know you heard that from Chris, that you have to spend some time talking to teachers about what a quality assessment looks like. How do you develop quality items? What are good distractors for multiple choice? How do you write a good rubric? All of those things are things that I think we think teachers know how to do, and some teachers know how to do it really well, but other teachers don't. And so we've spent a lot of time trying to build that assessment literacy with teachers and to help build that capacity on campuses so that we get better quality assessments, not just for SLOs, but for kids through all of the things that teachers do with their students throughout the year. Another one of the big challenges is the data and collection system. When we started, we didn't really have a good data and collection system. We had a lot of things that we did kind of piecemeal. We put some things in this system and we printed them out and we did some things with them. I would not advise going anyway with paper. So now we have an internal database that we've built with our MIS department that collects all of this information and actually provides, it connects to the student information system. It pulls in their roster of students. You can put your pre-test scores in. It calculates what the growth target should be. You put your post-test scores in. It calculates whether you met your goal. I mean, all of those things happen automatically now, which is something we had to learn over time. That isn't something we knew how to do at the very beginning, but it's definitely become a really valuable tool and has definitely streamlined the process. If you talk to the teachers at the beginning, they would say one of the hardest parts was all the extra pieces of putting my roster together, entering all of that information, figuring out my goal. All of those things are now done for them. So if you can take away some of those collection and data pieces and make those automated, that's really, really valuable. I think another one of the big challenges is embedding that practice into campus culture, so it's not just another thing that's added to my plate that I have to do. Some principals do a really great job of talking to their teachers about how this integrates into their work. And when that happens, SLOs work really beautifully. And that's the challenge is, you know, building that capacity in the principals to have those conversations with teachers about why this is valuable, how this can be used for their professional growth, how this can really impact students. One of the big things we get all the time is how do you ensure fidelity? How do you make sure people aren't cheating? There isn't a surefire or foolproof way of making sure that everything is done well, but I will tell you that 99% of teachers are doing what they're supposed to do. They're doing the things that we want them to do, and they want to do them well because they care about kids. There's probably a little tiny percent that doesn't do what they're supposed to, and oftentimes those things are reported. Oftentimes, administrators are going in rooms and they see those things happening. We've also put a lot of things in place as far as like policies and standards and, you know, protocols that help eliminate some of those things from occurring. And I think the last piece of the challenges was developing those growth targets. You kind of heard through that evolution of how we struggled with what does a good growth target look like? How does that work? The growth target obviously is only as good as the assessment, so if you have a really easy assessment, your growth target isn't really very useful. Your SLO is only as good as your assessment, and I think Doug said that earlier. That's really the truth. Your assessment guides whether your SLO is of high quality or not. So those are some of the big challenges we faced over the last 10 years. Some things you're going to want to think about as you're thinking about putting SLOs into place. You have to think about those business rules, those policies for leave, for student groups. You know, what happens if this happens? Every year there's a new situation, and we have to write a new policy. So even though you think you've gotten them all, you won't. And so that's a good lesson to think about, is to be flexible and to know that you're going to have to make adjustments and refine over time. What is your time frame for SLOs? When do you want them submitted? When do you want them completed? Like, what does that look like for your evaluation process? We have our SLOs submitted at the end of October, and then we have them finished by the end of April. So we have assessment windows. We've put some things in place to help with that time frame. So you have to think about what that looks like for year-long SLOs as well as for semester SLOs. How broad or narrow should your objectives be? We've chosen to make ours sort of broad. So we talk about it in terms of no smaller than 3 student expectations, but no larger than a STAR reporting category. STAR is our state test. So thinking about those big, you know, areas. We don't want it to be as broad as a state test. That's too big. You can't really focus in on that and close a gap. So we want to make it small enough that you can actually make an impact, but not so small that you're not really doing any good. Thinking about assessments and what kinds of assessments will be used, and are you using the same assessment for the pre and post test? We do use the same assessment so that we can show growth and are very clear that you can't use that assessment in any way during the year. That's against all of the rules. So really thinking about what that assessment looks like and what happens, what's that security protocol. All of the testing protocols that go along, we talk a lot about, making sure that you kind of, if you can, if you're using the same test, if you test on the same day so kids aren't sharing that information, doing the best you can to make sure you've got a good testing environment, making sure that you've done the testing the same way at the beginning of the year that you did at the end of the year. So thinking about those testing protocols. Are you going to have growth targets that focus on attainment or growth? We've chosen to go with growth. We think student growth is what we want to focus on. It's a value that we have. So we've chosen not to focus on attainment. But that is a tension that exists, and some of our principals really like the idea of having attainment goals. And so we've had to talk a lot about why growth? Why are we using student growth versus student attainment? And then the other pieces, and Chris talked about the training, all of the things she said are absolutely true. You have to think about what that training piece looks like for your teachers, for your administrators, for your central office. How does that work? And how are you going to oversee this? Like, who's going to be responsible for making sure that people have met deadlines? Who's going to be that compliance piece, whether we like to talk about it or not, is important. You have to think about how those things are being handled. So those are some of the things that we've kind of learned over time that you want to think about as you're developing SLOs. And so here's my contact information, and feel free to contact me anytime.